Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
All right, happy Tuesday, and thank you for listening, whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, or wherever you podcast. I actually, for some reason, woke up super early this morning. I think it's because I actually fell asleep super early super early. Before 11 p.m. for me is super early. Anyway, I fell asleep super early, and the 50-year-old body now apparently only requires like 6.5 maybe hours sleep. So anyway, I woke up pretty early, and I thought to myself, do I want to get up and get a workout in? And I actually started working on notes for today's show and kind of coming up empty and thinking, maybe I just need to kind of take a mulligan today and run a best of, as I've done in slow periods when the General Assembly's not in session, Congress isn't really in session. There's just not a whole lot going on politically, except, of course, the former president's under trial. And that's not really an Atlanta or a Georgia thing. And don't get me wrong, I do touch on that from time to time. And maybe we'll dive into it a little bit later on. But as I was reviewing some of my notes from yesterday's show to put in the podcast notes at ronshowatl.com, I actually stumbled across an op-ed piece that friend of the show, Jay Bookman, wrote for the Georgia Recorder when it comes to the GOP and foot dragging here in the state of Georgia on Medicaid expansion. First, what I want to do is I want to play you a little bit of what we played yesterday from the Politically Georgia podcast that airs on WABE, a local NPR station here, and also part of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Politically Georgia umbrella. This was Governor Brian Kemp with Greg Bluestein, Patricia Murphy, Tia Mitchell, and Bill Nigut discussing Governor Kemp's position on Medicaid expansion. He is essentially saying, not on my watch, not going to happen. I want to play you this first, and then we'll review some audio from Democrat Representative Dr. Michelle Au, who was actually on the very same podcast, a Politically Georgia podcast, on April 18th, talking about the political realities of Medicaid expansion in Georgia. First, Governor Kemp from last week.
So, Governor, does this mean in 2025, if this debate actually gets traction, if we see more Republicans putting their names behind it? Because this year, a lot of Republicans were wondering where you stood, publicly on it. We know now where you stand on it. But would you support this in 2025, or is it sort of are you issuing a veto threat essentially?
No, well, I'm just saying that, like, my position is to continue on the policies that the General Assembly voted on in a bipartisan way, early in my administration, and the Biden administration has tried to block. And we're going to continue. Look, we were fine with the legislature having a conversation about that. That's certainly up to them. I was respectful of that, but when they start talking about going to the floor and going to a vote, they need to be having a fiscal note. They need to be really answering the question, are you seriously going to vote for something that's going to take 713,000 people off private sector insurance and put them on Medicaid that pays a lower provider rate when these individuals go to a hospital, when private sector insurance pays more? I mean, to me, that's just not good policy. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat.
So that's a no for next year.
I mean, I'm in the no camp. Like, I am supportive of what we did. We need some more time to continue to implement and get people to sign up on pathways. And I know, they're not going to give us a leash for the rest of my, little less than 3 years. But we got to make some headway on that.
So my political checkers brain thinks, okay, this is Governor Brian Kemp hoping that his Georgia Pathways project is somehow this marvelous program that manages to give insurance coverage to more Georgians who currently are uninsured. And he looks like this hero and can run for the U.S. Senate in 2026 because we all know he's going to run for the U.S. Senate. I know he cracked the joke about going to sit on his tractor. Yeah, sure. But maybe that was me thinking, well, maybe he's hoping that this Georgia Pathways project just somehow turns a corner miraculously in the next 2 years. It's not working right now. And somehow makes him look like the conservative hero that both broadens healthcare coverage for his constituents without putting people on government-backed health insurance. Jay Bookman's op-ed today in the Georgia Recorder actually, versus my political checkers brain is him going political chess. And I'll explain that. But first, I want you to hear Representative Dr. Michelle Au, Democrat from Gwinnett County, talking about the political realities of Medicaid expansion when she was on the same Politically Georgia podcast on April 18th. Here's Patricia Murphy.
Representative, along with conversations about IVF down at the General Assembly, there was what we thought would be more extensive conversation about expanding Medicaid here in the state. It did get a little bit of a last-minute sort of chat in a Senate committee with a vote, but the vote did not go forward. What do you think right now is the state of both Medicaid and just simple coverage here in the state? How many Georgians still need to be covered by insurance before you would feel comfortable right now?
So look, Georgia has the third highest uninsurance rate in the nation, right? Those are the facts. That is the data. That is not a good number, right? That is not a good cohort to be in, right? So that is really something we're going to need to look at. I don't think that there's anyone who's at the state capitol that doesn't know that at some point we are going to have to expand Medicaid, right? We are one of only 9 states remaining that has not. Most other states, even in our area, are following suit because they realize that this is a fiscally responsible and ethically, morally imperative choice. Having put it off yet another year is yet another nod to the political reality of the state in that Governor Kemp has passed a Medicaid waiver plan, which is much more, I will say, politely modest and underperforming in terms of its ability to cover the huge number of uninsured patients in our state that could qualify for Medicaid. And I just don't know, honestly, just purely from a political standpoint, since we're talking about this, how much more this administration can tolerate all the bad news stories that roll out literally every 1, 2, and 3 weeks about how poorly we are doing in covering the patients in our state, right? At some point, the political calculus of campaigning on a bespoke Medicaid limited expansion plan under the Kemp administration gets overshadowed by the fact that it is simply not working, right? So I hope that as we move into the next session, I've been given assurances that we will continue this conversation, but waiting yet another year for healthcare is something that a lot of patients cannot afford, and frankly, something that our state cannot afford.
Now, remember, she said that on April 18th, a good, 4 or 5 days before Governor Brian Kemp drew a line in the sand on the same podcast live from Athens, Georgia last Thursday night, that it's a no for him. He's not going to bring it up. It would be vetoed if it landed at his desk next legislative session in the year 2025. She said that before he said that. So what she said absolutely cannot come to be because Governor Brian Kemp has put his fist on the desk and said, no, not going to happen while I'm governor. Okay. So he's taking a calculated risk, right? Greg Bluestein followed up with Dr. Michelle Au with this question, however.
Representative Au, there is this growing narrative among Republicans. There's a growing number who have said openly and publicly that they support expanding Medicaid. There's others who say it more privately. But there is this thought that in 2025 that could be sort of the watershed year for Medicaid expansion, because no matter who's elected to the White House, there'll be a new opportunity. Either if it's President Biden, if he has a second term, he's unlikely to extend Governor Kemp's waiver program. And if former President Trump, he wants to nullify the entire ACA overall, right? So there is this sort of narrative among Republicans. They want to get this off the table and expand it if they can, and take it off the table for Democrats in 2026 when Burt Jones, Chris Carr, Kelly Loeffler, whoever is running for governor. But I've also heard from a lot of Democrats who say that they should have been more aggressive about cutting deals with Republicans this year, even for minor victories towards expansion. Of course, Democrats can't do anything in the legislature without GOP support. But do you think Democrats played their cards as proactively as they should this past session on Medicaid expansion?
Look, everything in the legislature is a math problem, right? We cannot pass anything without the help of Republicans because we do not have an electoral majority, right? So in terms of saying we should have played more hardball or we should have, done more of this or that, there will always be talk and there will always be Monday morning quarterbacking. But the fact of it is that if we want to get this done, we need Republicans to help us, right? So if Republicans are unwilling to look at this issue head on and say the things in public that they tell us in private, then I really don't know what to say about, their priorities and whether they prioritize the care of their constituents and our patients over the political reality that they feel they have to work in, right? In terms of playing hardball, there's only so much leverage you have when you're in the minority. And really, honestly, what we need, in that Republicans are unwilling to help us, is that Democrats need the majority to get the work done, right? And I think this is going to be an animating factor in turning out people in November to vote for Democrats so we can finally move the ball on this issue.
First, let me say, I think the world of Dr. Michelle Au, Representative Dr. Michelle Au. She's been on the show a couple of times. She is about as smart a person as I've ever had the opportunity to have a conversation with. I mean, I know I've had conversations with smart people, but she's like really smart. Not just from a medical background, but from a policy background. I mean, she is a student of policy. And here's where I would also pivot to say, I'm not so sure she is a student or a professor of political reality. I don't see Georgia voters in 2024 in the current climate giving Medicaid expansion the due it needs to be given at the ballot box this November. And I don't think she does either. I think that's just a party line, something that you have to say. Obviously, she would prefer Democrats had control of the state legislature and would prefer that in 2026, the Democratic Party fielded a candidate that could win the governor's office as well. I mean, maybe she'll be that candidate. I don't know. Just speculating. Listen, we could do far worse. We could do far worse than having a Representative Dr. Michelle Au, a Senator Elena Parent, someone of their ilk running for governor in the state of Georgia. However, when she says that essentially, Georgia voters going to the polls in 2024 need to consider that, the state has been, and reaffirmed to have been this past session, gerrymandered to the point that Democrats taking over the state house, the state senate, that ain't happening. But I also want to talk to some other political reality. I keep referring to an opinion piece that Jay Bookman wrote in the Georgia Recorder. By the way, on the same day she was on the Politically Georgia podcast, April 18th, that spoke to some other potential political realities when it comes to a time frame for not the if, but the when. As Dr. Michelle Au said, Georgia finally relents and expands Medicaid in accordance with the Affordable Care Act, which is now 14 years old. So when we come back, I'm going to read through as much of as possible that opinion piece from Jay Bookman in the Georgia Recorder when the Ron Show returns here on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, or wherever you podcast. RonShowATL.com is the website if you ever want to go back and listen back to past episodes, including yesterday's. Oh, by the way, I didn't give it nearly enough time, so I'll maybe revisit this in the second half of the show today. I got booted in a parking lot in Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta, at a grocery store parking lot, and I'm not saying I wasn't guilty with the way I parked. I just think it's a bit of a snapshot, a microcosm, a Polaroid, if you will, of why we have to have a talk about our transit options in a major city, especially along the Beltline. And that's a hot potato right now here inside the city of Atlanta, and really should be a conversation for any growing city of size in the United States. But let me get back to the conversation we were having about Georgia and it being the second highest state for an uninsured rate in the United States. That's terrible. And one of only 10 states not to expand Medicaid. And those two facts are obviously intertwined, right? Jay Bookman with the Georgia Recorder, friend of the show, he wrote an opinion piece on April 18th. That was 5 days ago, about the GOP and its cynicism and its obstinance denying Georgians the opportunity to be insured, to be healthy, to become, if not already, viable in the workforce. He writes, and I'll include this in the show notes at RonShowATL.com. Healthcare is not a luxury item, a commodity reserved for those who can afford it. It is a basic human right. Healthcare eases pain. It reduces suffering. It extends life and enhances life. It helps the lame to walk, the sick to heal, the old to age gracefully. The joy that a newborn baby brings, the relief and comfort that hospice provides. From beginning to end, Throughout our lifespans, healthcare is essential. A society that is economically and medically capable of providing healthcare to its members, yet chooses not to do so, is inhumane. Unfortunately, our state of Georgia fits that description, Jay Bookman writes. We have the second highest uninsured rate in the country, and even in the midst of an historic economic boom, the number of fellow Georgians without health insurance is rising, not falling, by hundreds of thousands. Why? Because of conscious choices made by those elected to govern us, and because we continue to elect those who make such choices. It's certainly not a question of resources, Jay Bookman writes. Our state's coffers are full to overbrimming, and the federal government is committed to paying most of the cost of expanding Medicaid to cover those unable to get insurance elsewhere. In fact, it currently costs the state of Georgia more money not to provide health care to its poor than we would spend in providing it. On top of all the human costs and the social costs of such a policy, the refusal to expand Medicaid costs our state hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Think about that. Those who govern us are so callous, so stubborn, you've heard me use that word before, about not providing health care to their fellow Georgians that they're willing to cost the state money to continue not doing so. Let me pause and remind you, by the way, that there is a political reality that he's getting to in this piece that I just, when I got to it, I was like, oh. It was like watching a soap opera and a plot twist. Anyway, Jay Bookman continues. Let's start with that last line again. Those who govern us are so callous, so stubborn about not providing health care to their fellow Georgians that they're willing to cost the state money to continue not doing so. That's perverse, he writes. Kentucky expanded Medicaid 5 years ago. Louisiana did it 8 years ago. Arkansas implemented its version 3 years ago, as did Missouri. North Carolina finally did it in 2023. Even Mississippi seems closer to adoption than Georgia. Again, Jay Bookman asks, why? Normally, the place to look for an explanation of such obstinance would be politics, but you would look there in vain. In a poll taken in January by the University of Georgia, almost 70% of registered voters in Georgia said they support expanding Medicaid to cover all of the state's uninsured poor. Georgia Republicans supported Medicaid expansion by 47 to 39%. A majority of self-described Georgia conservatives backed it by a margin of 51 to 36%. Nationwide, according to a poll by KFF, a health policy research group, 60% of Americans now have a favorable view of the Affordable Care Act, with only 39% of Republicans saying they would still support repeal. The ACA, also known as Obamacare, is so popular now that even Donald Trump says he opposes its repeal, claiming instead to have a secret plan to make it, quote, much better than it is right now and much less expensive for you. Jay Bookman puts in parentheses, he doesn't. And yet, here in Georgia, Medicaid expansion is still off the table. Okay, are you ready for the plot twist? The part where you join me and you go, oh, yeah, because it didn't occur to me either. Here's what Jay Bookman writes, last two paragraphs. Maybe, and I'm just guessing here, it's a question of timing. The second and final term of Brian Kemp as governor ends in 2026, when he's expected to run for the U.S. Senate seat now held by Jon Ossoff. Maybe the plan is to delay expansion for another 2 years so that Kemp can sign it into law just as he launches his bid for federal office. He'd be playing hero by solving a problem that he himself helped to create. Yeah, I did the same thing you did. Here's the last line. If it sounds cynical to suggest that politicians play with human lives like that, maybe it is. But I guarantee you, cynicism plays a role in this somehow. Did not consider that. Did not see that coming. But it makes all the sense in the world. So here's the thing. Jay Bookman's piece was published last Thursday. Thursday, I think early afternoon, right? Before Brian Kemp's appearance on the Politically Georgia podcast. No, actually, it was like 1:30 in the morning. So Jay Bookman burns the late night oil. Anyway, he posted that early Thursday morning. And Thursday night, Governor Brian Kemp goes on stage to tape a episode of the Politically Georgia podcast in Athens, Georgia, and apparently did not read Jay Bookman's opinion piece in the Georgia Recorder. Sorry, Jay. It's not required reading for the governor, I guess. Happens to the best of us. My point in all that is, if that is the calculus, the political chess, I'll say, that Governor Brian Kemp is playing, then he made a mistake and provided a soundbite for whoever his opponent's going to be in 2026. It's going to be John Ossoff, right? Because otherwise, what Jay Bookman's saying actually makes a lot of sense, because Governor Kemp would have the best of both worlds. Well, hey, if the Pathways project somehow does work out, if giving it another year or two, like we've given 50 to trickle-down economics, does it eventually pay off, then he looks like a hero to conservatives and anybody who might be independent, but actually, as those polls that Bookman cited, believes that we should be covering the uninsured. Governor Kemp looks like a hero. But if it fails and he signs Medicaid expansion into law on his way out, at his 11th hour on the way out the governor's office before announcing his run for Senate, then again, he looks like a hero. Except now, because of the Politically Georgia podcast episode last Thursday night, we have a soundbite. Back after this. Thank you for listening to The Ron Show.
This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
So I feel like I almost kind of pulled a pin on a grenade and threw it in to the door and then walked out yesterday when I kind of lobbed a little, hey, this happened, and I was covering Governor Brian Kemp's live taping of the Politically Georgia podcast and going point by point by point that I had literally 2 or 3 minutes left in the show. And I was like, oh, you know what? I need to bring this up. Something happened to me over the weekend, and I've actually just minutes ago learned something about this that made my jaw drop. And this isn't just about me. I promise you, it's not just about me. I was temporarily really ticked off, very miffed, and decided to be vocal about it. But in any event, I stopped Sunday, cold, chilly day in Atlanta, kind of weird. We had this, rainy front move through. I say weird. It's not really weird. It's April. These things happen. April showers, right? But it was chilly. It was chilly and cold. And so I did as I've done for maybe the last 4+ years since I've lived in Old Fourth Ward. I circled the parking lot outside the former Murder Kroger. It's just Kroger now. I hereby deem it no longer Murder Kroger. I circled the parking lot outside. Miserable. It was just so cold. Found no spaces because it's such a small parking lot, the size of a postage stamp. And then they have parking underneath the store as well because it's on a raised, in a raised building above the rest of the parking. And there were no parking spaces. Now they have in recent months or a year or so added EV charging spaces, but I drive a Mazda 6. It's a 2019 Mazda 6. I love my car. The marvelous Ms. Mazda, Miriam, I call her, Midge. But she's not an EV. I'm sure in her heart she wishes she were, and I do too, but she's not. And back when I bought that car, brand new in 2019, could not afford an EV. So she gets good mileage, somewhere in the 27 to 29. Not bad. And I don't really have to drive it that much anyway. So very economical 63,000 miles on her in the 4+5 years or so that I've owned her. It's not about the car, though. Let's get to the parking problem. I did not park in an EV space because what if somebody needs it? I don't want to do that, and I'm not going to park in a handicap space because obviously I'm not physically disabled and someone may need that. However, over the years, I've gotten used to, and listen, I'm slapping my wrist, okay? I'm slapping the back of my hand. Bad Ron, bad Ron. I have made use of time in situations like this, space that inhibits no one from doing what they need to do, getting around in the parking deck, getting out of spaces. I have used space that isn't allocated for parking. On the exterior of that parking lot, there is a wall that lines up on a steep embankment. Atop the embankment are homes, and so there's a wall. And again, plenty of space for people who like to park parallel along that wall. They should honestly just paint some spaces there. They just don't. And I've done that on the exterior. I've used that space. On the inside of the parking deck, it's a very similar scenario because running alongside the parking deck is a decline from North Avenue as you come down that driveway to the entrance of the parking deck on the left or the parking lot dead ahead. There's a wall inside the parking deck that, again, Folks, for years, myself included, I'm saying I'm guilty, have parked along the side of. To be honest with you, before yesterday, I'd never noticed a no parking sign. Never had. And I certainly didn't see anything that said something along the lines of, no parking, strictly enforced, we will boot you. But damned if I didn't get booted. I walked in and I got some groceries. I was in there maybe 12 minutes, came out, and there was a boot on my car and a sticker on the window. Oh, crap. It was only $75. It's more the principle of the thing. And here's, I'll get to what I learned this morning about this entire situation that really kind of made my jaw drop. My first instinct was I was pissed. I have parked there for years. I had the audacity to feel like I had been unjustly booted. I've parked here for years. You've never done this to me before. I've been violating this policy, and why are you suddenly now punishing me? I would like to say, by the way, it would be nice if the property owner who has contracted with this booting company to kind of give us a heads up. Hey, we're going to start enforcing this. This is getting a little out of hand. Things are getting, tight. There's people parking here and using the Beltline, yada, yada, yada. Give us a little heads up. That's all I'm asking. And it's not Kroger's job to do that. So, but it would be nice if, somebody put up some flyers or something on the doors. Hey, listen, parking's becoming a premium around here. The Beltline's very popular, and we can't have people just parking where they want, even if there's space, but it's not designated for parking. You can't do that. We're going to start booting. Give us a heads up, just something along those lines. Also, there is this. As I've mentioned, because this is the Kroger along the Beltline, it's a popular spot right now. The Beltline is very popular. The East Side Trail with all of its restaurants and bars and brew pubs and parks, and people are looking for ways to get to the Beltline that don't live anywhere near the Beltline, and so they're looking at parking lots. I'm sure they're looking across the street from Ponce City Market, where there's a huge parking lot in a shopping center, and I have no idea if they're able to keep tabs on who parks there and crosses the street, but there are signs that tell people not to do that. It's to me, it's like hard to enforce. Much like it's hard to enforce where I parked illegally, there's also a sign that says 90-minute limit, meaning you can park in this parking lot if you want to, but you have a 90-minute limit. The problem is there's no gate when you come in. There's nothing to timestamp you. There's nothing, you don't get a ticket. It's not like going to the Battery where you get a ticket with a time on it, right? There's none of that. So it's not very scientific. It's not easy to pull that off. And to my knowledge, I'm pretty certain they don't have somebody scouring the lot and marking tires to keep tabs on how long a vehicle's been there. So I would venture to guess that there's been no enforcement of the 90-minute policy. An enforcement of the don't park where we're telling you not to park policy, okay, sure, but not the 90-minute limit policy. And to me, that's the thing. Like, if you're trying to keep people from using your parking lot to go to the Beltline and hang out there for a couple, 3 hours or whatever, that's what you need to be focusing on, right? And also, if someone parking a car in a spot that you've just deemed isn't a legal parking space, and I'm surmising or thinking the reason for that is I don't want you to, glut up the parking lot or the parking decks because we need to, keep it free for those. Booting the car doesn't get the car out of the way. And don't get me wrong, I'm happy it was just a boot and not a tow, because a tow is going to cost a whole lot more. But I guess the point I'm coming to is they're trying to combat a problem that we're talking on this show for a long time now is going to be not just a now problem, but a very not far down the road future problem. And that is access to the Beltline. Now, I'm pretty sure that Kroger, as the merchant, doesn't have a say whatsoever, doesn't care, an opinion, like, as a corporate entity, I bet you Kroger doesn't give a rat's ass if there's Beltline rail. But I can guarantee you Kroger would benefit from there being Beltline rail. Some sort of mass transit access. And by the way, the mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Andre Dickens, in an interview last week on WANF TV, and as was reported in the Inside City Hall column at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Riley Bunch reminded me of this morning. He's floated the idea of the autonomous pods, the little vehicles. If you've gone to a Braves game and parked at the Galleria, you may have taken the pedestrian bridge over, and you see the driverless pod cars that hold like maybe 6 people. That ain't gonna fly either. And you know, those that are opposed to Beltline rail aren't going to instead accept taking the grassy berm area where the rail's supposed to go and turning it into just a smaller street for a driverless pod car to go back. They're not going to go for that either. They're not going to go for that. But what I'm saying is, we're seeing exactly what I've sort of characterized and didn't intend to. I just kind of stumbled into this, characterized a problem that is a now problem and an in the future problem for the Beltline and the merchants along the Beltline and those of us who live here and still have to kind of do our daily or weekly rituals, grocery shopping, errand running, et cetera, and so on. And it's a parking crunch. Here's what I learned today that I did not know when I started talking about this over the weekend and yesterday. The owner of the property that Kroger sits on, the owner of the property who decided to contract with a booting company to start booting vehicles. And by the way, this is a recent thing. I know people, they've been booting. They have not been booting. They have not been booting the spaces that I parked in. Because I can tell you, up until this weekend, there were people who always parked along those walls on busy days. Always. And the fact that they were doing it on a cold and rainy day just makes it more of a middle finger to anyone who was, and again, I'm guilty. I violated it. Still, it's kind of a new thing. The owner of the property is the Atlanta Development Authority. The city of Atlanta Development Authority. Invest Atlanta. Invest Atlanta owns that property. So then it has to be Invest Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, that decided, all right, we're going to have to ratchet up enforcement of those who violate parking laws on this property. This property that we have a grocery store and an office building and a few restaurants and other merchants and don't have nearly enough parking for, not just for them, but also the Beltline patrons who now we are trying to say, don't park here to use the Beltline. And yet we've got a mayor of the same city of Atlanta that runs that development authority, Invest Atlanta, who is waffling on rail access to the Beltline. Do you see the problem? Is this like the light bulb moment for you? Because when I found that out today, and I only know that because in real estate, I can go and see who owns just about any parcel of property. And so I just quickly did that on a website that we use. And I was like, well, son of a bitch. I was literally like, what the? Oh my God. It's the city of Atlanta that owns this property that decided to start ratcheting up enforcement of booting people. Meanwhile, on the other side, on the other hand, the mayor is like, well, I don't know so much about the streetcar coming to Ponce City Market, which is literally what would happen. The new extension that has been sort of rubber stamped, there's supposed to be construction on this very soon, is going to go from where the streetcar normally stops near the Ebenezer Baptist Church. It's going to come all the way down Irwin and then connect at the Beltline and come to Ponce City Market. Everybody who talks about how, the streetcar doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't serve any purpose, that immediately, just that extension, gives it a purpose that it didn't have before for residents of Atlanta to use to get to and from where they live, which I can do. I can go down to Edgewood or Irwin or Krog and catch the streetcar. It's just a couple blocks for me. And then find my way to Kroger or Ponce City Market or across the street if I want to go to TJ Maxx or to go get my back cracked at the joint, Home Depot, the pet store, Whole Foods. Yeah, it's the city of Atlanta that owns the property that the Kroger sits on that they've decided they're going to start ratcheting up booting. And so let me review what I did. The first thing I did was I was like, well, I'm ticked. And I can't be mad at Kroger, but I did take my groceries back upstairs and I'm like, I want a refund. Why, sir? Well, my car got booted and the manager at Kroger's like, well, but what does that have to do with us? I said, all I know is whoever your landlord isn't going to benefit from my money going to you. So you're just transitive property. You're just going to be a part of the statement that I'm making. And it may be a statement that only I'm hearing, but I'm going to sleep at night knowing that my money's not going to your landlord. And damn if it's not the city of Atlanta. So, I mean, I can shop. Listen, where I live, I can shop at the Glenwood Kroger. I can shop at the Edgewood Kroger. I can shop at Publix just down the road at Ponce. I can, again, cross the street, Whole Foods. I could go to Trader Joe's on Monroe. But Trader Joe's is a problem, too, because the parking lot is always packed. Always packed. And I'm not even going to look up who owns that property. I'm pretty sure it's not the city of Atlanta. It's not Invest Atlanta. It's not the Development Authority. But they, too, will post these signs that tell you, oh, you can only park here for so long. You gotta be doing business here. I just, if you don't have a gate, if you don't have a ticketed mechanism like you do with the battery that tells you how long you're there for, there's just no way for them to police that. I just wanted to share that whole story with you because I found it pretty interesting that the city of Atlanta owns the property that is now booting people at the former murder Kroger on Ponce and Ellen Avenue, trying to keep people from using the parking lot for means other than shopping at Kroger. And when I was on the Nextdoor app and I posted this warning, it was just kind of a public service announcement. Hey, listen, if like me, you've gotten used to being lax about, parking in spaces that aren't deemed to be spaces, but room for you to park without inhibiting others, they're going to start booting you now. And this lady mentioned, she said, yeah, I work in that office building and I park in that parking lot or parking deck whenever I get a space because they charge me $24 a day to park in the building deck next to the Kroger, which is outrageous. You shouldn't have to pay to park where you work. I'm sorry. That's just, she too would benefit, by the way, from there being light speed rail, streetcar extension along the Beltline to the stop that would be right in front of her building. Back after this. Final segment of the Ron Show. Join us wherever it is you do the social media thing at Ron Show ATL. Twitter X platform is where I do a lot of reposting and retweeting and chiming in. The Facebook... Yeah, the Facebook channel, that's where I just usually post my blogs. And on Instagram, if I see a funny meme, that's probably where I'm sharing it. It's kind of what I guess Instagram is for. There's not a whole lot of content I guess I could do some video clips of the audio, but my gosh, y'all. Doing that version of that show would be a full-time job, and I have a full-time job trying to make money in residential real estate. In another case of dog catches car, y'all, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make light of this, but it's kind of funny anyway. This Hispanic restaurant owner, Richard Gonsmart, a Republican who voted for Ron DeSantis, owns a restaurant in Miami. He's kind of panicking a little bit because Governor Ron DeSantis' new immigration law forced him to fire 19 members of his restaurant staff because they were undocumented. And he has to pay a $500,000 fine, again, because those 19 employees for the restaurant he was doing pretty well with, they too were undocumented. So the Miami Herald has reported on this and mentions that restaurants and hotels and construction companies, other industries are experiencing a severe labor shortage now due to Governor DeSantis' crackdown on undocumented immigrants. We never hear from the right this conversation about the contributions that the undocumented make to our economy, how those who are in charge or own these businesses who are making the profits take full advantage of the undocumented population, often paying them less, saving them money, the business's money, because they know they can pay the undocumented less. The undocumented aren't going to go through FICA and Social Security and all the other deductions that come through. So the businesses are just as much at fault here as anyone else would be, right? Not only has DeSantis feuded with Disney, but now he's undermining other facets of Florida's tourist industry. Let me read you a piece from the Miami Herald. Richard Goldsmart, the fourth-generation owner of the iconic Columbia restaurant chain based in Tampa, says it's time for politicians to start listening on immigration. When federal immigration authorities arrived at his Sand Key restaurant in Clearwater to find outdated and non-compliant work documents for 19 of his employees, he was forced to fire them all, including 7 people who had worked with his family for decades. With 2,000 employees, it becomes very difficult to monitor it, he said. We think they're legal, but when we had to check, we found 7 people who have been with me 30 years, paying taxes, had children, grandchildren, and we were required to terminate them. The article continues, immigration and customs enforcement officials in Tampa would not comment on the case, and Goldsmart said he was still negotiating a resolution to the conflict. But the incident underscores the double scrutiny many businesses face as a new state law layers new immigration enforcement policies to existing federal rules in a way that is exacerbating worker shortages. It is a scenario that's playing out across Florida with restaurants, construction companies, and farms searching for workers as the political rhetoric over immigration is clanging up against a tight labor market and expanding population. Goldsmart is the great-grandson of Casimiro Hernandez Sr., the founder of the historic Ybor City restaurant that is the chain's anchor. Since its opening in 1905, the company has treated employees as part of the restaurant's family, paying them above market wages and benefits, he said. The article continues, many of his employees, especially those working in the kitchens and back of the house, are fathers, sons, and brothers, Goldsmart said. Remember, this guy voted for DeSantis. So when immigration officials told him the I-9 forms of his most loyal employees were not in compliance and he would have to fire them, he resisted. I told them I wouldn't let them go, and they threatened to arrest me. I said, that's a good idea. Why don't you all come and arrest me? But let me know when so I can have cameras here. Then they sent me a $500,000 fine, and I let them go. Meanwhile, Goldsmart said the incident, quote, almost put us out of business. And while customer demand has rebounded from the pandemic, the inability to find enough new staff has forced him to suspend his catering services and reduce restaurant hours. Carol Dover chimes in. She's the president and CEO of the more than 10,000-member Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. She said Goldsmart's not alone. Hotels are not opening all rooms because they don't have enough housekeepers. Restaurants that used to be open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner are now open just for lunch and dinner. And existing staff puts in extra hours, she said. Everybody's having to get creative with their thinking. I share this because we've seen the dog catches car scenario with politicians on the right when it comes to reproductive rights. But I don't think we're paying enough attention to what's happening in Florida, where Ron DeSantis, hey, listen, give him credit. He is one of those few Republicans who's actually decided that I'm not just going to implement policy, but we're going to enforce it even if it hurts business. Okay, let the business community that overwhelmingly supports Republicans figure out how hard this makes life for them and how it impacts their economy and then the economy on the whole. I think Americans need to have a better understanding of how our undocumented population impacts our pocketbooks and how much we benefit from having immigrants coming to this country, and how maybe it would be wiser for us to, instead of erecting walls and saying, no, go away, having a little bit more of an open mind when it comes to those who are coming here, who are seeking asylum or refuge from economic, environmental, or criminal instability in the countries that they're coming from. Again, a lot of it due to our meddling over the last century and a half or so, but who also want to come here not just for the refuge, but for a fresh start and an opportunity, and who are willing to put in the work. What a concept, right? As that restaurant chain owner, Mr. Goldsmart in Florida, suddenly now realizes, there is a place for folks, and they can become our friends. We can treat them just like family, and they can be invaluable, not just to our business, but our community and our economy on the whole. I'll include a blog that gives you a lot of that article in the show notes today at ronshowatl.com. That's going to do it for The Ron Show. Replays 5 to 6 p.m. today on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com. On demand all day at ProgressiveVoices.com and via podcast as well. Back tomorrow at 9. See you then.